Hey guys, what's going on? In today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about N8N nodes because N8N nodes are essentially the building blocks of N8N, right? So if you don't understand fully what are N8N nodes, then you will have a trouble building scalable workflows that grow and scale with businesses because it will be hard for you to understand which node you should be using to achieve certain business logic, for example, right? So once you understand these ones and how they work and how they connect between each other and which ones are the best that you should be using in your case scenario, then you will succeed and you will actually build proper and scalable workflows. Okay, guys, so we have a lot of nodes in here, so we'll cover most of them and I'll explain you what they do. And in general, the goal of this video is really for you to learn node types, and practical examples also. And why you want to do that, because you can't create workflows without nodes, guys. As I mentioned, the nodes are building blocks of N8N, right? So every automation starts, runs, and ends with a node. But before we dive into the in full depth, so what are nodes? So nodes are essentially, atoms of automation in a sense, right? So we have these building blocks right here. Let me just zoom in a little bit. So each of these ones are nodes, right? So they essentially are atoms of the automation in the sense of an N8N, right? So each node performs a single step, for example, trigger, action, or transformation. So we have trigger nodes right here that trigger a certain action or that trigger the entire workflow. Then we have transformational nodes. So each of these ones, it's gonna transform the data or it's gonna shape the data, right? And then we also have, for example, here, action nodes, right? So if I scroll right here, so these nodes basically perform some sort of action, right? So maybe Gmail app, you want to send an email, you want to get an email, you want to read an email, you want to tag an email, right? Or calendar, create an event, change an event, delete an event. And these are basically app action nodes in here, right? And as I said before, so think of the nodes and workflows essentially. So workflow is a chain of nodes connected together. So this would be technically not a workflow, but you know what I mean. Workflow would be basically these nodes connected together and creating a some sort of business logic to do something, do this and do that, and then you have a agent which will perform autonomous action, and then you're going to have the final result, right? And so that's essentially the workflow. But the nodes themselves, think of them as Lego blocks, and when you put the Legos together, you're gonna have your final piece or puzzle of Legos come to life in a sense, right? So that's essentially what the nodes do in N8N. So we have three core types of nodes in N8N. We have trigger nodes, action nodes, and exit or end nodes, right? So in most cases, you're gonna be seeing trigger nodes and action nodes. Exit end nodes are not as common in a sense that, you're going to be working a lot with agents and there isn't really a stop mark in a sense, right? It's going to be always autonomously running in the background, performing some sort of action. So the most common ones are going to be using trigger nodes and action nodes. For example, if I go to my template here, this is going to be a trigger nodes. So they're going to be triggering a certain action or they're going to trigger the entire workflow to do something based on the business logic or the nodes you've connected together, right? So the most common ones I would say would be something like scheduled trigger. For example, this one here. So this would be scheduling for workflow to run every day, for example, at 9 a.m. to do something. Webhook, when you're calling a workflow from a third party or web application, if you're like Microsoft or something, then you can chat directly with the workflow. So if you want to chat with your agent, in most cases, that's going to be this one here. And then you can also have this one, which is essentially sort of a manual execution. Once you click on it, it's going to trigger the entire workflow and it's going to run. Then we have unformed submission, where you can basically have a native form submission, business logic on N8N. I'll show you just in a bit how that works. Then from Telegram, third party like Gumroad, not really common one, but cool to have. Then Calendly, for example, once your lead submits some sort of information through Calendly, you can trigger the workflow to, for example, send it to a agent will analyze. Maybe you're going to enrich the lead and send you the final lead to your CRM, just an example. And then we have Gmail and Google Drive nodes as well, which are commonly used. All right, and then let's move on quickly to action nodes. And action nodes are exactly what they say they are. They perform certain action within the workflow. So in most of the cases, it's going to be something like Google Calendar. So, create an event, delete an event, update an event, Google Docs, read Google Doc or change Google Doc. Then message model, in this case, can be Perplexity. So if you want to, communicate with Perplexity directly, right, you can do that. Then you have Reddit and a bunch of other, action nodes. Again, this is really just a few examples. There's way more action nodes that you see here on a screen, for example. Okay, and I'll show you some actual real life examples and pieced together workflow so you can kind of see in live how it looks and works. All right, so you can trigger the workflow in a couple of ways. You can do manual. So if I go here and if I click on this one right here, execute workflow, which basically I'm doing it manually. So that's a manual workflow execution. And once I do that, it's going to trigger the entire workflow, for example, right? You can also do the same thing, for example, with this node over here, because you are manually triggering and it's going to run the workflow. And yeah, that's essentially manual workflow execution in a sense. Then we have schedule. So when we are triggering a workflow on a schedule, and the most common one would be a schedule trigger. So this node right here, if I open it up, what it does basically, you can run the workflow during specific days, weeks, months, right? You can set which days, at what time, midnight, 1 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., stuff like that. You can trigger between minute intervals. So essentially my point is really this triggers this on a preset schedule, right? So really good if you want to, for example, scrape something on a daily basis, or maybe you have a agent that will scrape YouTube or social media for daily social trends, and it's going to compile everything, analyze it, and then it's going to send you a daily update through Telegram, WhatsApp, or email, for example. All right. And then we have third one, which is Webhook, and Webhook essentially is right here. So what it does, it gives you sort of a URL, which you're going to bring to your microsas or web application, and you're going to put that into your backend, for example, right? Or maybe any other application, and then that application will send certain data to N8N workflow, right? So maybe if you have like an AI microsas, and for example, something is happening on that microsas front end, and then for example, user submits a request to generate. I'm gonna give you an example. For example, you have a microsas that analyzes images and then maybe generates some prompts based on this image and sends it off to the N8N workflow, right? So that's what you can do. You're gonna have a web application, then you're gonna have the webhook, and on your application, you're gonna generate some JSON data, which then will be transferred through this webhook to N8N, and then N8N will basically convert and analyze that data and do something with it, and then it's going to send it back to your application, or it's going to send it back to whatever the output you wanted to send, for example. So think of Webhook as a bridge between your application, a third-party application, and the N8N workflow that transfers the data in a sense, right? But it's different from API, guys. You might be like, oh, well, that kind of sounds like API, and not exactly. So Webhook is triggered, will be triggered immediately once the action does something, right? So once action is completed on the application, it's going to be triggered automatically, and that data will be immediately sent to your N8N through the webhook. Where with APIs, usually you're gonna request to get the data from API. So there's gonna be a request that's going from N8N to a third party. You're gonna request the data to a JSON with some body parameters and some other options. Then the API will process that data. It will check if you have authentication, if you have the tokens, and then if your JSON request is correct, it's gonna send you back the response or the data that you've been asking from it. Okay, so there's a bit of difference. Okay, guys. So okay, guys. I think we talked about this one just in a couple of minutes back. So action nodes, basically they connect to apps and services. It can be Gmail, Slack, Google Sheets, right? Send a message, post notification, get or update roles. Okay, so basically they perform a action in a sense. Then we have data transformation nodes. Basically, you want to edit a field, you want to remove duplicates, aggregate, or summarize, okay? Basically, you are transforming the data. So if I just go to my example here, I have quite a few transformational nodes here. We can have, for example, extract HTML, we can filter, extract from file, edit fields, right? So a lot of different nodes. I'm not gonna go through all of them because, just really giving you a crash course here about the nodes and what these type of nodes do. So again, download this workflow and kind of go through each of these ones, and you can just simply click on it, and you can kind of see what it does. Okay, for example, so aggregate, what it does, it's going to receive a data from the previous node. Okay, for example, there's a lot of data, and then we're going to aggregate all of that into a single data field. Okay, so we have a lot of data. For example, we for example receiving a JSON with like a bunch of data. So it's going to take that data and it's going to aggregate that into a single field, which is the data, right? So just really, there's a lot of reasons to do that, guys. I'm not going to explain that, but again, really useful if you want to, for example, send it to an agent, or maybe you need a specific way of processing data. So you're going to aggregate that into a single data field. Okay, so that's essentially what it does, guys. And let's move on to the next one, guys. So example edit fields. So let's talk about that one. So edit field essentially would be merge, and for example, I'll give you guys an example. So use case would be merge first and last name into a full name. Okay, so I don't know, Bob, or I don't know, let's do something like John Smith, okay, whatever. So what it's gonna do is gonna take the it's gonna take name John and Smith if it's for some reason separated from the previous nodes, and then it's gonna merge it into a single full name field. Okay, so what it does basically keeps data consistent. It reduces the payload size because it's important, like the payload essentially the amount of the data that you're transferring between the nodes. Okay, and it also improves your performance, right? So just to show you more visual examples, so how would I merge, for example, a two strings, or two, for example, first name and last name? What we would do, for example, there's going to be a string here, right? So I'm going to do something like this. You guys can see. Let me just expand that a little bit more, like this. Okay. So for example, here I'm using an expression, right? So this would be an expression to basically join two strings together, right? So this would be something like, for example, let me just call that full name, okay, for example. And the way it's going to work, so here we're setting a field which will be a full name, and then this full name will merge the first name and last name together using expression here, right? So let me just open up Notepad, guys, here. The way it would work, essentially, it would be something like this. For example, I would be receiving this type of JSON data from the previous node, and then essentially we are grabbing the JSON, which is first name and last name. So we're going to concatenate two strings together using a JavaScript expression in here, guys. Okay, so that's essentially how it works in basic terms. All right, guys, let's move on to the next one. So let's talk about aggregation. So basically, aggregate, what it does, it combines multiple records or multiple data points into a list, in a sense, right? So it turns many outputs into a single structured item. Okay, I think we talked about it just a couple of minutes ago. So essentially, if I have aggregate node right here, and if I receive a lot of multiple data points or data sources together, I can aggregate that into a single data field name, which will be data, for example. So useful for summarizing multiple rows from sheets. Okay, if you have a lot of like stuff or like rows coming in from sheets, you can basically put that into a single data field, or collecting all orders for daily report. Okay, so a lot of use cases, but these are really just two of the examples. All right, guys, so for node settings, really one of the good practices, I do suggest always rename your nodes what they do. Obviously, I'm not going to do it here because it's really just a a boilerplate. But for example, if you are doing something with this code node, which basically is JavaScript, for example, always rename it and say something like, "What are you doing with this node?" Okay, for example, I don't know, filter out something. Okay. So when you look at the workflow, you kind of understand what each of these nodes does, especially when you're a beginner. It's still important. It will help you just simply learn nodes faster. And also always make sure to configure authentication and credentials for your apps. Really important because a lot of these ones are requiring authentication, especially when you're working with APIs. You're going to be creating a lot of authentication and authorization accounts. The way it's going to work, you're going to go here. I believe we're going to go to generic, for example. I'm giving you a quick example, but if you guys want to learn exactly how it works, make sure to check out my YouTube channel. I have a bunch of videos on these ones. So you're going to go to generic credential type. Then you're going to select header. Okay, and what's going to happen here, you're going to click on create new credential, and what's going to happen here, you need to enter a API key and also the value, which is usually something like so a value is usually API key. So this is going to be your API key field or API token. In the name is going to be something like, for example, authorization, okay? Or it's going to be X API, whatever. It will depends on the API key provider. So when you're working with these ones, make sure to check out documentations for OpenAI. Just go to, like, for example, OpenAI API documentation we're getting started with, or Gemini reference documentation, and you're gonna find all this information in there. So essentially, once you do that, it's your authorization account for that API. So you're gonna click save that, and you can always reuse it, okay? So once you save that and it gets authenticated and activated, it's basically every time you use a, for example, something like Appify or maybe like File API or OpenAI, right? So it's gonna be already pre-made for you. So you just have to basically select it from a list, and you can recycle it across your workflows, okay? So a lot of people do it manually. So they do it through send headers, for example, and here they will basically do it this way, authorization, whatever, and then here they can enter the API key. But the risk is, you guys can see right away, API key is immediately exposed. So if you actually share the workflow with public or with somebody, they will have your API key as well. So it's really just introducing a very possible security risk, okay? I don't really see any reasons to use these ones. Unless it's a public API key, that's a different story. But if it's a private API key, guys, always make sure to do it through create your credential, because that's much safer and better way to do that. Okay, guys, let's talk about expressions. So expressions are really, in a beginner-friendly way, it's basically a JavaScript. Okay, it's a JavaScript code. It lets you use and work with dynamic and variable data. Because, for example, something like fixed and Canada, that's a string, that's a fixed string. You can't really do anything, okay, because it's a static data. Where expression gives you a way to process and work with dynamic data. Okay, so again, if I go back to my set node example here, guys, or edit fields, was it? Yeah, you guys can see here I'm working with dynamic data, right? So if I'm receiving this from the JSON from the previous node, okay, I need to work with expressions of JavaScript, okay, because I will be able to take this and plug it in here and then concatenate the two strings together, and then I'm gonna have a full name, which will include first and the last name, okay? So this is all thanks to JSON and JavaScript, okay? And all of this is a dynamic data, okay? Because data is coming dynamically from somewhere, okay? It's not static, okay? It's not, because if it will be static, it would be always exactly the same data, but it's dynamic because this data can be changed from its source, okay? So that's why it's an expression, but also you can call it a variable, but essentially it is a dynamic data, right? In a sense. Okay, guys, and then we have a couple commonly used nodes, but again, I'm not gonna dive into that too much. Again, I'll be leaving a link for this entire PDF if you want to download it, check it out. Also, I'll be leaving a link for this folklore over here, guys. But before we conclude the lesson, guys, let's actually look at a real life example of a workflow that is already pre-made and ready to go. Okay, so here I have an example of a e-commerce product photos. So essentially what it does, it references an image example. If I open my spreadsheet here, guys, I have a couple examples of products. For example, here, I have an example of these glasses here, and also I have an example of this blazer, okay? So what this workflow does, it's gonna basically be triggered manually from here, execute workflow. Let me just do it actually while we go through this. It's gonna get the image URLs, then it's gonna download the images using a get method for HTTP, okay? And then we're gonna wait, okay, just in case so we don't crash the API. And then we're gonna send it off to ChatGPT's or OpenAI's node to analyze the image. It's gonna basically analyze the image and tell to the LLM or AI in the next node what it is. And then this LLM will create a prompt to generate a fully generated AI image based on that image, okay? So we're trying to get a e-commerce image based on a product, so we can upload it, for example, to Shopify or whatever, any other e-commerce platform, right? So then all this data will be merged, okay? Because we have basically two images. So when we are working with multiple data sources, we need to merge it into a single source in a lot of cases. Then we're gonna send that to OpenAI or ChatGPT, and here we're gonna basically generate an image, okay? You guys can see here I'm working with a expressions. So if I open up my JSON here, guys, let me just scroll down here. You guys can see this is the prompt. And in order for me to get that prompt, I had to drag this expression in here. And that's how we got the prompt from this JSON here, guys. And it's dynamic, it's an expression because every time prompt will be different. So it's a dynamic data, right? Then we're gonna do something converting base64 to data because basically AIs and computers don't really look at the data or images like we do with eyes. They look at it from like they see everything in binary, so it's zeros and ones. So we need to convert those zeros and ones into data, because once we process once we create the image with AI, that's going to be a binary data. So we need to convert that binary data into an actual data, so we can have our images like these ones. Okay, yeah, so this is the final result. So if we wouldn't have this one, we wouldn't be able to preview it, because that would be just a bunch of gibberish. So we need to convert computer language into a human language or data in a sense, right? So then we can have an actual file or the data, which we're going to be uploading to a Google Drive in here. And then we can also add the URL, so we can easily access the final image from here, guys. Okay, so if I click on my drive, you guys are going to see now I can see the final result, guys. Cool. And that was fully generated by AI in less than 5 minutes, guys. Okay, and that's essentially how workflows work once you put them together, guys. Again, if you are curious about this workflow, make sure to subscribe and like my channel, because I'll be dropping a tutorial on this video, and I will be also providing a complete free template for this workflow. All right, guys, and that's a wrap. So again, this PDF will be available as a download. Also, the N8N Nodes workflow will be available as a free template, guys, below the video in the description box. I hope you found this video useful and learned something. Leave a comment below if you have any questions about N8N, automations, or AI in general, and I'm gonna help you out, guys, personally. And if not, as always, I'm gonna wish you happy building. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'm gonna see you next time.